Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Apotheosis on in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 71, The Dread Wolf's Bitch. Fearful that Fenen would suggest it first, I'd left without another word, and not even Joven tried to stop me. The whole clan would have heard the exchange. It might be one of those things of which we would not speak, but only round ears would have been deaf to it. I'd have to find the Inquisition camp and wait it out, give Hannah time to consider the sum of what I'd told her, and either rally Lavalin or turn them against me. Not that it mattered. I'd abandoned the Dalish in Crestwood, and whatever decision our keeper reached about the Well of Sorrows would be far more generous than the one I deserved. Besides, if I wanted my clan's love, I could have told an endless string of lies to secure it. What I wanted was their safety, and I didn't care if they hated me so long as I could seal the rifts and deal with the Duke. Whatever else she thought of me, Hannah would leave those tasks to me. It was her way. It had begun to snow by the time I put the arrivals behind me, and the cold night air delivered the clumsy sounds of a human encampment no more than a half-mile out. Though I didn't need its light for guidance, I let the anchor flare so the scouts would recognize me. This far north I couldn't count on familiar faces. If that drew the attention of some enemy from Wycombe, so be it. I was dying to kill someone. But no trouble came to meet me in the woods, and soon enough I found an Inquisition camp like any other, a scattering of red tents, a few tables set up for supplies and requisitions, and a handful of soldiers milling about in the light of a half-banked fire. With the anchor engulfing my forearm, there wasn't a one among them who hadn't jumped to attention long before I offered a formal greeting. Under an audition, I called out, because with or without my Valislin I was supposed to be the Dalish Inquisitor. Every last one of them was human, but a ripple of welcome swept through their ranks, salutes and nods and murmurs of your worship. However shaky my concept of trust, I understood the power of mutual self-interest. I needed troops, they needed the world back, and so long as I had the anchor in one hand and gold in the other, we were good. I drank an ale with them because that's the sort of thing the Inquisitor did, and caught up with news on Venatori movements in the western approach, as well the continued stalemate in Kirkwall between Prince Viel's forces and the city guard. I had Leliana's spies on the outside and Varric's friends within, both praying that the little prince would follow in the Maker's footsteps, take a bride and disappear. When I'd made a decent enough show of being a proper leader, I gave my goodnights and gathered up a few potions from the requisitions officer, who was quick to offer me a tent and profuse in his apologies. "Weren't expectin' you, worship. Ain't much, but can fetch some more blankets and such." "Furs?" "No, standard issue's fine." "Thank you." Inside the tent, I dusted the snow from my cloak and crouched to sink my magic into the earth, burying a fire rune deep below. It was a candle mark before the cold ground began to warm, and in the meantime I drank 2 restoratives for my supper. A bit of firelight seeped through the heavy canvas, but not so much that I worried about catching sight of myself, so I stripped out of my new leathers. Not that it mattered. My bare skin reminded me of his magic, but avoiding it acknowledged the power he held even in absentia. It seemed so calculated, and that was something about him I'd never understand. It wasn't enough to simply be rid of me, he'd found a way to ensure my own body would serve as a reminder, and he'd found a way to make me ask for it first. He'd always made me ask for it first, every goddamned step of the way. Even if he'd told the truth about my Valislin, Arlasa Malarivas was a joke. I'd never be free to find a clan. I'd never be free from the game or the god whose orb created the anchor, a thought that put ice in my veins. So much of my time in Haven was spent denying Andraste's touch that by the I learned the orb belonged to a god, the implication had lost all meaning. I tried to think of the anchor's power only in the abstract, but Fenen's words had given my fears a shape and a name, and I couldn't escape his logic. Corypheus respected neither the old gods of Tevinter nor the Maker. Yet he turned to the power of an elven god to breach the veil and enter the fate. It took little imagination to guess he'd have sought help from the roamer of the beyond. When Corypheus came for me in Haven, I'd been helpless to stop him from wrenching my arm out of socket, from crushing my wrist, from breaking my ribs against the trebuchet. If that's what a human pretender could do, what hope did I have against a true god? "Wow, your Shemlin really don't get the point of perimeter defense," said a voice out of nowhere. But not even the razor edge on my throat could distract me from who it belonged to, and I curbed my instinct for lightning even as a drop of blood sang out to me. A spell dissolved on my skin half cast, unspent magic dissipating into indigo sparks that illuminated the tent for an instant. The split mask of Joven's face was upside down and grinning where he was crouched above and behind me. "You're fucking insane, I almost killed you." He let out a dismissive puff of air, sheathing his dagger. "You'd never hurt me. Lathma, you ass, not on purpose. Everything you do is on purpose." He leaned down to lick my neck, and the song died. His tongue was coated in Vandal aria. Joven tumbled across me, rolling himself to the side and propping up on one elbow. His dark hair was unbound, falling lank behind him, and he brushed the back of his knuckles along my hip bone. "Like you'd fuck a shem," he said, as if that had been the most damning accusation I'd faced all night. There was laughter, somewhere, in the back of my throat like a cough. "Though I wonder," he said in a low voice, sliding his hand down to my stomach, "when was the last time you got some Dalish cock?" That earned a burst of real laughter. "You were there, as I recall. No wonder you're such a sullen mess. I thought you kept a whole clan in that castle." "Ah, yes, my harem. If it's not true, don't ruin it for me. That one was my favorite." "I bet it was, Lek," I smirked at him through the darkness. "So slumming it, then?" "Apparently. Better a few flat ears than the corpse orgies I keep hearing about." I groaned at the memory. Even Blackwell had confronted me about that one. Something about the word necromancy gave everyone the wrong idea. I found his hand and laced my fingers with his, absently rubbing my palm against his callus. "So you've become a connoisseur of rumors, then? You know Des Hannah keeps me hunting far beyond the woods." "You're hunting for her now?" "No, ma sa, I'm hunting for you. I can't say why your story's shit, only that if the truth was on your side you'd be solace with your people instead of hiding with the Shemlin." For a single moment, I thought he somehow knew. In the next, I breathed deep and reminded myself Haran did not have sole dominion over the word. "I made a mistake at the Well of Sorrows, there's nothing to be proud of." "You don't make mistakes, Suvarai lass, you make decisions and you own them. Walk me through it." I didn't have time to think about it. I was afraid and I fucked up. It's that simple. 2 minutes ago, I bet my life that you wouldn't fuck up under pressure. Between one heartbeat and the next you recognized me, decided that a knife at your throat somehow meant Lathma, and bit back lightning. That's fucking complicated. You're not capable of simple mistakes. You give me too much credit, ma sa. And you're not giving me enough. You know something we don't, and it's the reason you stood there gnawing on your own tongue while Fenen all but called you the dread wolf's bitch. A wave of nausea pushed me upright. Maybe I am. He scratched the back of his head and huffed out an exasperated sigh. Maybe you're the fella's fucking ass on. Haran died in Arlathan, Mommy died in the Dales, and you fell out of the sky to save Delenn from the beast. A god's a god, after 2,000 years of silence I'll take what I can get. It's not my job to fret about the creators, it's my job to protect the clan. The clan's in no danger from me. I'm talking about you." He laid one warm hand on my back. "I'd be a shit hunter if I didn't know what a scared rabbit looks like." I nearly laughed. It had been forever since anyone called me a rabbit without intending a slur. But he'd caught me, and there was no running. If I kept evading him, he'd only imagine something worse. Perhaps I couldn't give him everything, but I could give him enough. He deserved it, even if he hated me for it. I eased back down, twisting on my side to mirror him in the dark, trying to think how I could ever explain a man like Salas who defied explanation. "A mage saved my life after the conclave," I started. "I was imprisoned for trial and the Shemlin would have executed me, but he convinced them I could close the rifts. He taught me how and helped me strengthen the veil to prevent new rifts from forming. Not only that, he took charge of the rebel mages so I could draw on their mana to seal the breach." "This is your flat-eared mystic." "Not mine," I clarified, suddenly jealous of the girl in the rumors who still had him, "but yes. Though the Shemlin would never admit it, there'd be no Inquisition without him. The anchor would have killed me, but he stabilized it. And when Haven was destroyed, he led us to Terrasillan Te Loss. The rest, I couldn't say. He led me. He died for me, he loved me, he called me Vihanan. He was mine. No one in the Inquisition knows what I'm about to tell you," I said, dropping my voice low. They absolutely cannot know, all right. Savvy. He confessed that he was Elvean in the Arbor Wilds. Not to me, but to Mythal's sentinel, Abelas, and that's the only reason the well was not destroyed. Then he destroyed. Abelas said he would rather destroy the well than bestow it upon the undeserving. They're not like us. We're the Shemlin so far as they're concerned, shadows of a fallen empire. My companion convinced him otherwise, then begged me not to drink. He's pride incarnate, not a man to beg, but he did. Hands and knees, Joven, a living, breathing Elvean begging me. So I let it go. Joven laughed softly. I knew you couldn't make a simple God's damned mistake, real ass, but fuck. Yeah. You have to tell Des Hannah. I don't have any proof. Since when have you ever had to prove anything? I opened my mouth and then shut it again. From the moment I woke with the anchor, I'd stepped into a world that hated everything about me. Every day was spent proving to Cassandra that a pagan could be trusted, proving to Salas that a Dalish could be trusted, proving to Syrah that a mage could be trusted, proving to Vivian that an apostate could be trusted, proving to Gaspard that an elf could be trusted, proving to Blackwell that my forgiveness could be trusted, proving to Abelas that a shadow could be trusted, proving to the world that I wasn't a savage, a servant, or a whore. I'd completely forgotten the place where I had nothing to prove, the people who trusted me inherently. It was muscle memory that brought my forehead to his, a chaste kiss in thanks of the reminder, but his reply was nothing of the sort. Joven stroked the flat of his tongue across my lips, coaxing a flood of memories to the surface, the summer we bonded, the spring when we broke apart, years of affectionate indifference, that stunt with Kaelin in the Tirishan ruins, 1,000 sleepy winter nights, and our goodbye on the Amaranthan coast. He'd laid a hand on my cheek and I turned to take his thumb in my mouth, giving him one slow suck and savoring the roughness of his skin. Joven tasted of leather and blood, like a man who'd killed something recently, like a man who'd never washed with Shemlin soap, like the earth and not the beyond. So strange and familiar all at once, a song that I'd nearly forgotten. Ma essay. He pulled his thumb free and dragged its slickness along my jaw before kissing me hard on the mouth. His lips felt fuller and rougher than those I'd grown accustomed to, greedier, sloppier. I'd forgotten what it was like to be kissed by someone who had nothing to hide, and it was a drink of cold water after nothing but wine. I surged forward to roll atop him, cupping his face in my hands and desperate to swallow up everything he was. Finethis, he swore when I pulled back. When was the last time someone touched you? I can't even remember, I breathed, tightening my thighs around his narrow hips. It had been in an Inquisition tent just like this. In the Arbor Wilds, when I was still Dalish, exactly 18 days before. Even as I started to lift the hem of his jerkin, he tossed up his arms so that I could pull it off over his head. I shifted back in his lap, raking my fingers along the hard lines that sculpted his chest, the perfect knots of muscle at his stomach, and the outturned button of his navel. His body felt so different, slimmer, bonier gods, we were always almost starving, every day ending with just enough and never too much. No cakes or tarts or butter or cookies or anything richer than a sip of warm Hala milk. Joven was finding the differences in me too, cupping my breasts in both hands to weigh them against his memory, pushing them together and burying his face in between, so damned boyish and gleeful about it. He gently bit at the flesh of each one, and I fisted up his hair, remembering what it was like to have something to hold, and just holding. He caught one nipple in his mouth, and even in the dim light I could see the sharp contrast of my ashen skin against the cobalt of his lips, a slave brand. My breath caught and I wondered, was that what Salas thought every time? My stomach twisted, had that been the allure? He groaned into my breast, making me suddenly aware of how tightly I'd wound his hair around my hand. I loosened my grip and brought his face up to mine, kissing and licking and biting every place where his blood whispered with Des Hannah's magic, knowing in my bones that Joven was free. We moved together as easily as we ever had, hands and lips seeking out the angles of familiar faces, fingertips lingering on new scars in old places. Somewhere along the way he'd lost his britches, one of those roguish traits that I'd forgotten, and I reached down between us to stroke him, remembering the way he curved into my palm. The world tipped over as he snaked an arm around my waist to throw his weight and put me beneath him. His moved down my body, sliding his tongue along every curving branch of the Valislan I wore only in his memory. It meant everything to know my SA was the first to claim the bearskin I'd been given, that Salas had never seen. Gods, Salas. For an instant, I was back in the arbor wilds, my mouth crushed against his neck to keep silent despite an unrelenting pace that drove the air from my lungs. His name had been a chant then, an earnest prayer to the only one who mattered, Salas, Salas, Arlathma, Salas. Now it was Joven's cock pressed against my thigh and his mouth leaving welts on my neck, but I was 1734 miles away, that time in the darkness. He poured magic into me until the ecstasy was unbearable and my fingers slipped from his sweaty shoulders, tearing down his back. I cried out as I came, "Oh, my God, Fenharel," and he'd come so savagely, growling my name from the back of his throat. The anchor flared at the memory, and Joven startled back at the unexpected light. "It's all right," I said, hooking my ankles behind his thighs. "It does that, sometimes." I reached for him with my left hand and he tensed. I'd never used my magic with him before, never even thought to until Salas. For the first time, I realized how the raw power of it would unnerve anyone but a mage. "What do you mean, sometimes?" I grinned up at him, biting my lip, then pushed him onto his back. Propped up on my knees, I hovered over him for a second before easing down onto his cock. He hissed a breath and I hummed in an echo of his pleasure but not my own. The world felt dull and distant. My mana stirred restless and unspent, eager to surge and fill something that did not exist within him. I banished it from my mind and forced myself to live in my skin, focusing on the world around me instead of the one within. Joven bent his legs so I could lay back against his thighs, Rogue's fingers working to undo me, gently pinching my clit until my pulse throbbed against him. Not that it mattered. I couldn't quell the anchor and its light filled the tent, driving away my focus. I felt exposed, barefaced, and embarrassed. I lowered myself against his chest so I could bury my hand under the pillow at his head, and he shifted his hands to my hips, fingers teasing along the curve of my ass. In the darkness once more, I found a languid rhythm, but it felt like a song I didn't quite remember and I was always a step behind. My thoughts kept circling back to the Elvean blood under my fingernails and how Salas had stayed inside me for hours, the both of us slipping in and out of the fade. The air was so thick with magic in the arbor wilds I couldn't quite remember which side of the veil I'd been on when he'd whispered, "Arlath ma Belinaris, Marial." So then if he was the liar, why did I feel like the betrayer? Joven was silent beneath me, a master of stealthy sex in the middle of a camp, but my ears were bent to pick up the sound of Salas that last time and how smug I'd felt thinking the whole camp must have heard him. Gods, they'd all known that he was mine. And that was the blinding white thought in the heart of me when I came around another man's cock. Joven must have been holding back because he suddenly pressed his forehead into my neck and bucked forward to shut her out, Suvarai alas. Absently, I realized Salas had never asked my full name and I'd never thought to tell him. Chapter 72, Cold Comfort. In the morning, Joven was gone. There was no universe in which a Dalish hunter would abide to sleep in a Shemlin camp so poorly defended, and no doubt a half-dozen other duties or Delenn pulled him home. Which was all well and good, early mornings weren't exactly my best time anymore. I mopped the clammy sweat off my skin with a corner of the blanket and found a vial of lyrium tucked into my discarded cloak. Cold comfort after another exhausting night in the beyond. Sweet girl, Desire had purred. Would you like to know how many women he's called Vihanan? The lesser demons who'd promised the warmth of his touch had abandoned me somewhere along the waking sea. The ones that remained were of a more clever sort, offering knowledge. These wore at my resolve, for demons always kept their promise. Some questions hardly seemed worth risking possession, but others. If he branded his own slaves, said Sloth, which god do you suppose he honored? Others tempted me. There were so many questions I'd chosen not to ask. Ever since Adamant, I'd only wanted Salas to know that his past was his own and if he needed a new beginning, I'd gladly give it. I'd proved as much with an unconditional pardon for Tom Rainier, declared it whenever I spoke the name Blackwool. And hadn't that day changed everything? He never asked your true name, Despair wailed, shall I tell you his? I could take a demon in single combat, even one so strong as Despair. But if I slipped, if I faltered, if I failed. Besides, I couldn't remember the last time any gamble of mine had paid off. Fighting that urge, my desperate wish for any piece of the truth, drained my mana to leave me trembling and weak on waking. Every morning. Wondering. I unstopped the cork and it was done, another day begun with fevered brightness in my veins. The feeling was at odds with the gorgeous hush that had fallen over the woods when I stepped out from my tent. The world had gone white with snow, and I could just make out the soft sound of ice floes moving along the Minanter tributary beyond the row of cedars to the north. Gods, winter was pristine in the marches. Not like the blighted emprise, aglow with red lyrium and infested with dragons, statues of Fenharil glowering around every bend. No, this part of the world had few elven relics about, and for once I was grateful. Fenen's words still ring in my ears. 2 women glanced up from sharpening their blades by the fire, murmured their greetings to suit the morning's quiet. The mess officer had a warm bowl of potato hash for me, and it was sort of wonderful in its blandness, the first real food I'd bothered with in days. I took my time, scraping the wooden spoon around the carved corners of the bowl, in no rush to return to Lavalan. Joven had at least agreed with me that we couldn't tell Deshanna the full truth. If she knew an Elve and lived in Skyhold, nothing would stop her from traveling to see him. Of course, my SA thought that was exactly what the whole fucking clan should do. Gods, I remembered the wild devotion that sprang up when I'd first met Abelas, but I'd been able to impress upon him the precariousness of the situation. Salas hated the Dalish. What I didn't say, when I'd finally stumbled into the truth, Salas rained down on me harder than a Templar. There was no telling how he'd react to an actual confrontation, but we could not afford to lose him. Once Corypheus was dead, there was no one else who could neutralize the orb. If that thing were simply left alive and writhing with divine magic, it would beckon every power-hungry magi stir in Tevinter, every grasping demon in Fade, and, I feared above all else, the god to whom it belonged. I wanted it contained. I wanted the nightmare to end, I wanted Arlasa Malarivas to be true, I wanted to find whatever clan would have me and disappear into the Arbor Wilds. I wanted the truth. Perhaps it was no coincidence that I'd gained so little from Elvain like pride and sorrow, but was it too much to hope a weary elf might find those called peace and joy? It was worth trying. I was meant to be a keeper, not left minding Andraste's flock. I pitched my little wooden bowl and spoon into a washbin and went to raid the potions table, clearing out everything we had and securing each vial in a strip of worn cotton. The requisitions officer's eyebrows bunched in dismay. Your worship. Head to Wycombe and get whatever you need. Not to replenish, but to stockpile. Tonics, lyrium, grenades, all of it. If the Duke sends more bandits, we're going to need a lot more than this to cover our people and the Dalish. Now, that's gonna take 50 gold just to. Not your problem. I slung a leather pouch to the table but bit back the rest. I'd spilled more gold in Halam Shirel so Vivian could dress me like a Shemlin whore. Joven was right, I didn't have to justify myself to anyone. I'd spent an obscene amount of coin on every other faction in Thedas. A few potions meant nothing compared to the gold I'd wasted shuffling my troops from one petty land dispute to the next. Salas had me so scared about holding myself above suspicion that I'd done nothing with the Inquisition to better my people and I was fucking over it. Carefully, I adjusted the heavy bag over my shoulder and left camp without another word. My advisors would have to make do with whatever news Nightingale's spies brought back to Skyhold. The idea of trying to send a raven drained the life out of me. Dear Josephine, we'll be back when the human noble you allied us with stops murdering my people. Hope you find someone to gather the elfroot while I'm gone. Past the first few trees I snapped up my barrier, then carried on with my staff gripped in one hand and the anchor blazing in the other. It would really not do for the Inquisitor to blow herself up fending off friendly fire in the woods. No sooner had I left the bounds of human earshot did a familiar voice call out to greet me. Anathera, sister. Sanuman, I returned, smiling. I had 2 sisters, but only one who never said my name. My hood was down, and she'd clearly been warned, because when she stepped into my path she gave no reaction aside from the barest arc of an eyebrow. I could have been her twin, 2 years younger but born on her name day, the both of us green-eyed and marked for June to match. Sans Valislan cut across her cheekbones to the top of her lip, while mine. Well. She was dressed in white leathers and wool, auburn hair beneath a slip of snowy silk and a longbow slung over one shoulder. The extra measure to her belt did not escape my notice. She must have been some 3 months along. Over the ocean and back, she said with a half-smile. And back, I marveled. Is it always like that? I didn't need to follow her gaze to know she meant the anchor. Only when there's a colony of bees in my bag. Is that a Shemlin metaphor? No, I chuckled, slipping the bag from my shoulder to fish one out. I've actually got 15 jars filled with bumblebees and wasps. She took the squat bottle gingerly, turning it in the pale morning light. Asleep. And awfully cranky when you wake them. Just like Ardalin, she said, nodding over my shoulder. It was a pit of dread in my stomach as I turned. Adalin alone among my siblings had never known me without Valislin, still at her mother's breast when I'd taken the right. But there she was, the little waif, as silent as the rogue we'd all thought she'd be. Emotions didn't flash across her features, they sculpted them. Horror breaking to shock that softened to sadness. At the same time, I was seeing her anew. Where Sanuman and I were ashen like our father, Adalin was pale like her mother in a way that only elves could be pale, almost pearl-scent, and Silas's Valislin were nearly aflame in the cold. With the color still so angry and her skin welted up and swollen, it was hard not to see what Silas saw, a brand. Oh, I breathed, but it felt like gut punch. You're all grown up. She beamed, and gods, I remembered what it felt like to be 14 so damned proud. If I could take the awful thing that Silas said to the grave, then I would. Didn't matter if it were true or not, Thedas had enough noble lords shitting on the Dalish without the ghosts of Arlathan joining in. At last, Adalin reached out to tentatively touch my face. Her fingers were hot, fire just beneath the skin, and her amber eyes flicked over to Sanuman then back. She thumbed off a tear at my cheek, and it was all right with me if she thought it was pride. Then she slid her little hand down to my neck, digging into a sore spot and grinning with her tongue bit between her teeth. Well, you've got some Dalish markings at least, she snorted, and Sanuman's shoulder shook with smothered laughter. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that wherever he was, Jovan was grinning like an idiot. Chapter 73, Just the One. Fenen came to stand at my side, swearing by Phalandin. We'd taken a party of skirmishers out to see what our keeper had called a great evil in the valley, but I found only a rift the shape and size of a small everite deposit. It glitched and shifted a few feet above the glen where a handful of shades drifted aimlessly through the tall grass. I'd seen more demons push through in places where the veil was whole but thin. I nearly said so, but held my tongue. Without the anchor, even the smallest rift would spoil the valley. It might only spit out 2 or 3 shades at a time, but the supply was infinite and the Dalish were not. As if latching onto my thoughts, Fenen spoke up softly. Arla and Marin died here. Deshanna had sent them out to gather herbs, but we didn't know about this place. Must have killed a half-dozen demons while our hunters collected the bodies. I very nearly lost Kaelin. My heart twisted. They were second cousins of mine, too young for Valislin but children only in the Dalish sense. I'd kept a barrier on Marin once while he went toe-to-toe with a dwarven bandit. I'd seen Arla land her arrow in a man's throat during a raid, but their weapons wouldn't have even pierced the hide of a demon. How long did it take them to realize that? Had they tried to run? Fenen laid a hand on my shoulder, and I made no effort to hide my distress. Not simply for the loss of life, but the awful irony of a creator's magic returning to the world only to tear holes in the veil and loose demons upon Ardalan. I could mend the rift, but the damage was done. Kaelin? I inquired. Demons kept coming, made for a damned sloppy retreat. Clawed him straight across the back, but he didn't drop her. Didn't even stumble. But the wound festered like he'd been bitten by the wolf, and I can only praise Mythal that demons don't carry the taint or it would have taken him from me. I fixed my eyes on the rift, aghast that such a tiny thing could have brought so much harm to the clan. Kaelin was a dear friend and I couldn't imagine Lavalan's Hallow without their herdsman. Couldn't particularly imagine him with Fenen either, but evidently that was the case. He's healed up now. One side of Fenen's mouth tugged up and he nodded. Asking about you. What did you tell him? That the creators have set you on a difficult path. All of them, or just the one? That he didn't answer, so I handed him my staff and looked over my shoulder to give Adalin a wink before walking down into the valley empty-handed. So to speak. As first, I would have downplayed my own role to strengthen the clan. I'd have thrown down cover with Adolin for Fenen to leap into the fray so our warriors could work through their grief and rage. And when everyone had done their part, I'd have quietly sealed the rift and gone to Deshana for healing that I didn't need. But my position within the clan was too precarious for false modesty, and I needed to give Lavalan's new first a reason to believe that I'd sought only to protect the anchor at the Well of Sorrows. Somehow, that made it easier, finding little truths that led away from the only one that had mattered at the time. Arlath Ma, Vihanan, I am begging you. Real. The memory burned there a moment, real and solid and true, and then I was sidestepping a shade to mark the rift. Cords of magic lashed out like lightning and the demons were blown back into the fade. I threw my left hand into the air to thread the veil through the anchor and the rift split open, revealing a glimpse of raw fade through the narrow slit. That influx of magic brought a handful of wisps through the rift, twisting them into wraiths. In another moment, it wouldn't matter, though. I wound the veil around the anchor and it writhed, jerking and pulsing until the cord snapped back into my palm. Cut from the fade, the remaining demons dissolved as the tear mended itself, and then I was alone. Walking back up the hill, I had a clear view of my Lethalans' surprise, each of them prepared for a battle that never came. Chapter 74, Betrayal is the blade forged in hate. With all three rifts sealed and daylight fading, we entered the snowy woods. I'd forgotten how it felt to travel among the Dalish, how silently even our warriors could move. We reserved laughter and conversation for the safety of camp, until then we walked with our ears sharp and weapons drawn. None of us found Dareth Shirel by luck, no. We forged that path with every careful step. And so it didn't matter that our day was done and rest around the corner. Fenen passed me Illyrium. He must have thought me near exhaustion. I'd spent more magic in one day than he could contain, but I didn't need it. Not like he thought I did. Even so, I thumbed off the cork and tipped back the vial, feeling awash in a sudden surge of magic. Behind me, Adolin watched with curiosity, so I tossed her the empty bottle. She caught it left-handed and took a cautious whiff, scrunching up her nose at the sharp minerality. Her little pink tongue darted out for a taste, eliciting a Cassandra-like snort from Fenen. At that age, even a drop would set her whole world glittering and bright. I laid an index finger across my lips and tapped twice, "Don't tell Shauna." Adolin glanced quickly at her first and he gave a resigned shake of his head that sent blonde hair falling into his eyes. "You're spoiled, Firestarter." She really was. I'd never even tasted lyrium until Haven. Though Deshana kept it for emergencies, it was a rare thing indeed for a keeper to spend more mana than she brought into the world each morning. Since the breach, I'd forgotten that too. Slowly, the demands of the Inquisition had come to be a way of life, and there were days I had more lyrium than wine. By the time we returned to camp, the sky had turned the darkest blue and I could hear the sleepy sounds of Hala bleating their goodnights. I had the sudden urge to bury my nose in their soft fleece to breathe in the scent of home, a far warmer welcome than the trickster's teeth flashing in the torchlight ahead. He represented safety to be sure, but unlike the gentle wolf in Mythal's temple, we carved Fenharel with the ferocity he deserved, lips curled back, eyes wild, and ears flattened. As I passed by, habit bent me at the waist in deference to a god too fearsome to reject, and I became keenly aware of just how many of my Lethalin watched me do so. They'd all heard what Fenen said the night before. They all wondered. Yet the more I wrestled with it, the less his words felt like an accusation. He simply had enough distance to acknowledge what I could not. There was no other god still roaming the beyond, no creator whose foci would still thrum with living power. It was irrelevant that the lie about my Valislan bolstered his theory because there was a more damning truth I'd kept to myself. When I was still the Chantry's prisoner, Adon's patient observations made my fevered ravings a matter of public record, and the first words I'd spoken after falling from the fade had been, "Too many eyes." I had only dim recollections of my time lost in the beyond, yet I'd caught a flash of something in the murky water of the Crowfens when Cole stood between me and Fenharel to whisper, "So many eyes peering from underneath." A sense of. Fenen laid an arm across my shoulders, pulling me from my thoughts and through camp to stand by Shauna at the largest of the bonfires. A hush fell over the clan as I stepped into the light, barefaced before them for the first time since my childhood. I fixed my eyes on an arrival in the distance to avoid the full brunt of their reaction, yet their quiet shock felt like a tangible thing. "Lethalin," our keeper began. Today the rifts in the valley are no more, healed by our sister, herald for a god of the people, whatever the Shemlin would have us believe. As Deshana continued, it became immediately clear that Jovan had given her some censored version of what I'd told him the night before. In turn, she doled out only what the clan needed to know. That I'd walked the raw fade, that I'd stood in the temple of Mythal, that I'd seen the crossroads, that I would usher in a new era for the people. I'd grown numb to the sort of proclamations the Shemlin made in my name, but it was something else entirely to hear them from my keeper. It wasn't the game and it wasn't hollow human faith, but something so purely elven that it stole my breath away. If Deshana had not sent me to the conclave, if Justinia had not cried out, if Corypheus had not lost his grip on the orb, if I had not bent to collect it, if Salas had not managed to save me, I'd not rewrite my own history to find divine providence where there was none, yet I felt an overwhelming sense of awe and gratitude. I had come to possess a creator's magic. Then our keeper began the Song of Mythal, and 100 elven voices lifted in praise. Adrift in the familiar sound, I thought nothing of it when Deshana took my hand in hers, but by the time I realized what she intended it was too late. The anchor sparked at the touch of her magic, and she threw my hand aloft for the people to see. No. No, 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 no. I'd been in the midst of worship before, somewhere out in the snowy expanse between Haven and Skyhold, but nothing could have prepared me to stand at the heart of it in the woods I called Anethera. My people, my songs, my gods, my home, my every comfort slipping away as the only family I'd ever known fell to their knees. Looking through the crowd, I felt a staggering sense of loss. I'd said my goodbyes already, once the morning I'd left for the conclave and again in my heart when I'd so carelessly said cast your spell. This was another sort of goodbye, consecration. Please get up, I thought. Get up, get up, get up. When it was over, Deshana led me through the camp to greet the clan, but what was done was done. I was a spectre, free to move among them but no longer one of them. I felt it in the trembling hands of my kin, saw it in every reverent smile, heard it in each plaintive antiranition, could almost taste it in the cold sweat that broke out on every Haran's brow. I'd escaped Andrasta to become the herald of another god, and it hardly mattered who. Whether blessed by the creators or cursed by the wolf, the anchor was a weight dragging me down, down, down to a place where no one could reach me. After a time, my keeper paused by a dwindling fire, the song of Silas under her breath as she renewed the wards that kept it burning smokeless and bright. Orange light glinted off the beads that tipped each long braid of her hair, and the lilac threads of Gilanane's Valislin shone brightly against the darkness of her skin. You have changed completely, Delenn. Without and within. I exhaled, letting the breath stutter from my lungs. Keeper. Your magic tastes like death, she said. Perhaps you belong to Phalandin. Though I knew it was Amalia and not Lithanaver that colored my mana, I couldn't help but frown. The darkness surrounding Phalandin once seemed no more ominous than a starless sky, but in the arbor wilds it became an ocean of blood. I practice necromancy. Meditate on that decision, she nodded. You may find death calls to you for a reason. Perhaps, I said without conviction. We are trained to fear the wolf, but he is not in every shadow, Delenn. Fenen makes a compelling case. As did the raven called Fear. I dropped my voice to the barest whisper. Abelas told me that Fenharel did not kill Mythal. Deshana turned to face me, her eyes narrow with concern. Whoever said that he tried? We do not tell tales of Fenharel's murderous heart, but of his treachery. Death can be an instrument of justice or compassion, but betrayal is forged from hate. Yet we trust him to guard our camp, we pray for him to take our enemies. We do not trust him, Delenn. We unleash him. Would you submit to wear his collar instead, let Fenharel bring a Dalish to heal? If you find yourself bound to the wolf as you fear, pray for strength to break the chain. I meant to laugh, but it came out far closer to a sob. She was asking me to fight the god who vanquished 2 pantheons through sheer guile, before whom the stars scattered in fear. Deshana gathered me into her arms, a thing she had not done since, perhaps not since I'd first killed a man. I am so proud of you, Delenn, she said, stroking my hair. You are a thing of sylvanwood and light, bending and never breaking. Hold the tension but a while longer, you are a child of Mythal. For a moment I recalled the Well of Sorrows, when the anchor seemed lost beneath the waters and 1,000 voices seemed so welcoming and clear. Whatever I'd given up was not lost, only one step removed. I had a sudden, desperate urge to see Morrigan, to lay hands on her, to know what she knew. "Keeper, do you mean to drive Suvarai Lass from us a second time?" I thought this was a feast. I twisted in Deshana's arms to see Joven behind us, the tiniest baby elf in his arms and a scrawny whelp plastered to his back, little hands clinging to the belted strap of his tunic and toes digging into his sides as she climbed defiantly higher. "Oh my gods, Atisha. You remember Auntie, yeah?" Joven winced as she pulled on his hair to climb up for a better look. She couldn't possibly remember me, but she shook her head as if she did, then cupped her hand to whisper in her papa's ear. He nodded conspiratorially as she rambled on, his grin growing wider. "She is very pretty," he agreed, and I bobbed my head in thanks. "Are you a big sister now, Atisha?" The girl nodded enthusiastically, black ringlets bouncing, then slowly released her grip on Joven to shimmy down to the ground. She wavered on her feet for a moment, eyeing her grandmother before turning tail and taking off at full speed in the opposite direction. Joven watched her go, then pulled me down onto the makeshift bench of a busted axle. "This is Eli," he said, shifting the well-swaddled baby into his lap while fishing for something in his pocket with his other hand, "and this is for you." He passed me a small flask, identical to the one I'd lost in the attack haven, and I smiled. "Ma Serenas, Ir Isola." "Obviously," he said, giving Deshana a friendly glare. With that, she disappeared into the camp as keepers are wont to do. I twisted the cap until it dangled from its leather strap, then took a long pull of the shittiest Antivan brandy I'd had in memory. When the burn settled down, I stroked the back of a finger across Eli's chubby brown cheek and he rewarded me with a grin like his father's. "He's very handsome, Ma S.A. It's true. Shall I give you one?" "You can try," I laughed, knowing full well it would be years before my body was a safe enough place to hide a child. He smirked. "Halam Shivanas. Speaking of. Where's SY? Eating, hopefully. This one takes everything she has. Let's find her." All around the camp there were wild boars on spits, their bellies stuffed with forest mushrooms and long onions, with flat breads baked on the coals underneath to catch the drippings. From where we sat I could see some of my Lethalin carving up the meat, little ones running underfoot to snatch up the scraps, and elders sitting back to smoke their pipes. It felt like I could slip into the fade more easily than I could join their midst, so I shook the flask. No. I'm all set." "It'll pass, Suvariel," he said, leaning into me. Deshana gave them a show, and it was a good one. They needed it. But I figure love and worship, they're not so far apart. Right now they're high on it, but they'll come down. Give it time. I took another swig from the flask. I've been told that before. "Seriously, you should eat. I'll die if you lose those tits. Whatever the Shemlin feed you, send us a wagon of it." He finally broke me and I laughed, stealing a third sip for courage then relinquishing the flask to his care. "Ma Nuvanin, Knifey. Let's go, mage." We stood and walked together through the woods, Eli cooing quietly into his father's shoulder. In the distance I could hear what could only be Kalen's flute joining in with the drums, a sure sign the evening had not conformed itself to my sour mood. Instead, however, Joven brought me to a place where 3 aravals were clustered together, and I didn't need to see the piles of sawdust all around to know it was a little ambush. My father stood up from where he'd been crouched by the fire, and it was a shock to see him, a mop of auburn hair like my own and an easy grin that made him seem younger than Salas by far. Gods, and he was, by a margin I could not even begin to comprehend. It was only the branching lines of Valislin and dark under-eye circles that made his face seem older. "Oh, my stormy girl," he said, recalling the night when I first called lightning, struck but unharmed, a mage before I'd lost my first tooth. He threw his arms around my neck, and for a moment I was too stunned to even return the gesture. But then I did, inhaling the scent of sylvanwood that always clung to his skin and wishing desperately that I was still marked for June. At last he pulled back to hold me at arm's length, regarding my new face with a reverence I did not deserve. Even so, I held my chin high, pretending it was the gift of a god and not a parting blow from the man who must have quietly hated me all along. Chapter 75, out of context. The veil felt like a sieve and my spirit a light that poured through unimpeded, alighting in a body I'd left cocooned in the warmth of an arrival, thick furs below and hollow wool blankets above. It smelled like sylvanwood and straw, leather, and apples and elves, softer and sweeter than the heavy musk of human sweat. Everything was solid and close, totally unlike the maddening shapelessness of a fluffy human bed and the cavernous expanse of sky hold. I was half atop Kalen with Fenen's arm flung across my back, aware of Joven curled up with his Delenn in the bow. For this, the Shemlin called us animals. Only rabbits would sleep in a burrow, huddled together for warmth in the wild. And if that's what we were, then I wanted nothing else. I was content in the wooden warrens where touch was way of life, a back warmed, a shoulder scratched, a hand held, a nightmare calmed. The Shemlin called us savages too, while every other race systematically tore itself apart. Dwarves divided themselves between stone and sky, decreeing that casteless whores could birth noble sons, that mighty kings should abandon their duster daughters, that sun-kissed storytellers could never go home. The Cunary denied every trace of family and dedication to duty, and Shemlin shuffled their children from one kingdom to the next with every new alliance. They said we were uncivilized, but they were the ones with widows and orphans left uncared for. They were the ones with names for such things, instead of simply acknowledging each of their own as a person worthy of care. They were the ones with whorehouses and brothels, who regulated sex like lyrium while binging in back alleys. They were the ones who modeled marriage after a maker who stole his bride from her husband, as if a god had any need for a woman. Since the Shemlin persisted in calling me her herald, I couldn't help but wonder what exactly Andrasta ever gained from the Maker's love. It was Mafaroth who freed her from slavery, Shardan who aided her in battle, and Hessarian who ended her agony on the pyre. So far as I could tell, the Maker was no better than Fenharel, who at least never claimed to love anyone at all. And perhaps because our most fearsome god took the shape of a wolf, because we were hunted for sport by gods and mortals alike, because our ears were too long and our feet too bare, the Shemlin called us rabbits. From where I'd sat panicking in the quiet confinement of my house in Haven, it seemed they were the ones who favored cages. I could barely remember to close the door, much less lock it behind me, to willfully deny the stars. It was a terrible isolation, and months went by where I touched no one but the corpses I looted for gold. Months. As camaraderie emerged, I learned to subsist on small gestures, Varric's arm looped around my waist at the tavern or Iron Bull slapping my ass with good-natured disinterest. Sometimes Cassandra would clasp my hand after battle, and sometimes Blackwell might square my shoulders in the practice yard, but mostly I remembered the warmth of Dorian's thigh beside mine when we sat in his cabin, a bottle of brandy and Redcliffe unspoken between us. I pressed my lips into a hard line, remembering how many nights I'd run out under the stars to pretend that my lethalin was out prowling, stealthy and silent among the trees. Some irrational part of me itched to run once more, pretend that if I ran far enough I'd find him standing there in the snow, my hunter in the woods. Even before that first kiss, Salas felt like coming home. When he called me lethalin, it might as well have been a spell to spark the rune traced by my veins. We were bound together by the blood of the people. And even though he knew what I did not, that I could never be what he needed, he'd said it anyway. Arlath Ma, Vihanan. I understand why he called it a mistake. If I were honest, the idea churned up something dark and terrible, to imagine growing old away while Salas remained forever in his prime. But if he'd ever felt love at all, there was no fathoming the casual cruelty of our parting. I'd seen dogs put down with more care. Salas envisioned every detail of a mural so perfectly that he painted each one whole cloth, could anticipate every possibility in a game of chess with no board. There was no pretending that Crestwood had been anything other than a precisely calculated move. He'd wandered Thedas as a flat-eared hermit long enough to know exactly what it would cost me to walk that same path alone. He'd lost his people in the fall, so he knew exactly what it meant to never go home. And after everything Deshanna said about betrayal, I couldn't help but buckle under the weight of reality. This was the game. I do adore the heady blend of power, intrigue, danger, and sex. When Gaspard aired out Celine's dirty laundry, her first instinct was to burn Halam Shirel to the ground and arrest her mistress. Few could play the game as skillfully as Briola, but she never even saw it coming. The Shemlin Empress didn't love her, she fetishized her, the imbalance of power between a noble and a servant, between a human and an elf. It was filth, and after my own turn at the Winter Palace I'd needed to wash it off. I'd returned to Skyhold shaken and drained, but not solace. I had forgotten how I missed court intrigue. He'd come back ready for a fight, sparring with Vivian and Dorian, then snapping when I called the elves our people. How it must have irked him to hear it from a slave-marked and mortal girl, Shem blood in her veins. He didn't die for me in Redcliffe at all. Regardless of whom my people are, I joined the Inquisition to save the world. Gods, he'd come so close to telling me that night. Getting you into bed is just an enjoyable side benefit. As I found my distance, it burned me up that he'd pretend my freedom was something he could grant. I wasn't his. I was never his. The realization rocked me hard enough that Kaelin shifted beneath me, and by the time I'd eased out from under the weight of Fenen's arm and through the back flap of the Aravel, my heart was racing. Sy sat by a dwindling fire, her hair a gentle cloud flecked with freshly fallen snow. She looked up from Eli at her breast with a sleepy smile that stretched Andruil's bow, her eyes skipping across my features as she learned my face again. I ducked my head and slipped out from the camp, folding up the fade to step beyond where our scouts would roam. The woods of Wycombe had been my winter place since childhood, and I ran between the trees like a ghost, disturbing nothing. I was ever just below the branches, just above the twisted roots, just between the trunks, just because if I ran fast enough it all blurred together and maybe I was still me. A Dalish mage, first to her clan, marked by no god but June, yet to play the game. About a mile out, the trees gave way to a little clearing where Satana's wan light reflected off a blanket of unblemished snow. I stopped short within the shadowed woods, too Dalish to run in the open. I'd have missed it altogether if not for some subtle motion that caught my eye. A white wolf crouched at the edge of the glen and all but invisible in the snow. My breath caught in awe. Wolves were common enough in the free marches, but none as large as this. Lean and lanky beneath a heavy winter coat, pale eyes catching the moonlight. One slender ear quirked and it turned, its steely gaze cutting through the darkness to find me where I stood. Instinct should have thrown me back a pace, but I couldn't move. It was fade-touched. And suddenly there were three figures bursting into view, long cloaks flying out behind them as they cut across the clearing. I had no trouble from the size and shape of them discerning a Shemlin and two elves, and that was all that stayed the anchor in my palm. I hesitated only a moment, then tore off after them through the woods. Chapter 76, The Exception. As it turned out, I wouldn't stop running until mid-afternoon. Along with two elves from the city, Jester returned to camp with a message from Lady Volant. Even in the flickering firelight where I found Sy still nursing her child, I could see that two words in the carefully worded letter bent beneath the weight of a coded call to arms: change. Regime. The rest of her message painted the problem in red blighted lyrium in the municipal wells. That the Duke would unleash such madness on the nobility implied that he truly believed it something safe, otherwise I couldn't fathom that he hadn't tested it in the alienage instead. He was nothing but a pawn, caught up in whatever scheming lies some Venatori whispered in his rounded ear. I'd have almost felt sorry for him had he not blamed the rats. Had he not sent bandits into the valley. Had he not attacked the only clan in all of Thedas that would still have me. I was a merciful inquisitor but not so far removed from my time as first that I'd forgotten what it meant to serve Elgarnan. I threw a single raven at Skyhold with Colin's name clutched in its claw, but by the time our hunters had grabbed their blades, there was nothing left but to shout, Andruilin asked. In that moment, I hoped she was the god of bloody sacrifice. I didn't care if she was as fucking mad as the Elve and claimed she'd be nothing compared to me. But for a small contingent of hunters and Haran left in the camp to watch over our Delenn, the whole of Lavallan marched with me to Wycombe. Under the Inquisition's banner, we moved through the streets at dawn, unmolested by the city guard. Jester led a sortie of Inquisition forces to flush out the red lyrium from the wells and ensure no harm came to the city elves. We Dalish stormed the Duke's estate, with Amalia rolling violet chaos through the halls before us and Deshanna casting wards behind. The elven servants turned on their masters just as quickly as we came, and any Shem fool enough to think they'd escape could only do so by throwing themselves at the mercy or the arrows of my sisters on the preposterously well-manicured lawn. It's swift and bloody. The Venatori were mere stragglers, yet to hear of their master's failure in the Arbor Wilds, utterly defenseless with their Red Templar protectors so weak from lack of lyrium. Jovan swept through them like the wind, his daggers loosing tendons and opening veins, while our hunters flew into the manor with the pent-up rage we'd all had a lifetime to collect. Fenen and I tore down the spiraling stone stairs on a hunch, finding Antoine with 2 of his personal guards in the wine cellar, heaving aside crates of Agrigio to get at some long-forgotten exit. We paused only a heartbeat at the door, exchanging a glance at once familiar to any Dalish, "Let's be savages." It would have been over too soon if I'd have called on the anchor, so while it flared with frustration in my palm, I cast a static cage, attuning its magic to strike the Shemlin alone. Antoine was not unarmed, nor were his soldiers entirely witless, but none could match a Dalish mage whose sword sang Dirth Eanazalin. Where Vivian called up a blade of pure spirit, Fenen reached for ice. I put my own runes on the door to guard our backs, but otherwise enjoyed the satisfaction of seeing the Knight Enchanter's skill in elven hands. Though he'd been named for the guardians of the Emerald Graves, Fenen moved with a distinctly feline grace. He batted at the Shemlin armor with bruising strength, freezing it up along the joints so that they had to fight for every tiny motion, then sundering apart the heavy pieces. He pierced and wounded with languid strikes, making a show of his boredom before finally disarming each one with a careless swat. Oh, but he was far from done. We'd gone raiding together before. I wandered through the cellar while Fenen continued to play, strangely wishing for Dorian to explain whether the Duke's collection had anything of any merit. Largely deaf to the sounds behind me, I settled on a bottle that seemed exceptional for its vintage in the Blessed Age and lopped off the neck with my stave. Lethalin. I returned to the back of the room where I'd left him, finding Lavalans first standing over what would soon be the Duke of Wycomb's corpse. I took a long pull of the wine, mindful of the sharp edge, and passed the bottle to Fenen. He drank from it much as Jovan would, adopting a careless posture that belied his complete and utter readiness for whatever happened next. The guards on the floor didn't so much as twitch, so I called Amalia to rouse them, sending Antoine into a fit of terror. The violet-eyed Shemlin dragged the Duke to his feet, holding him there because he was too shitless to stand. Fenen simply raised an eyebrow, then dispassionately poured the rest of the wine down the Duke's throat. Only then did I belatedly realize I'd met Antoine once before. He'd come to Skyhold not long after Adamant. We'd had dinner with Josephine and Cullen. One of his sisters was a mage, and we'd found common ground in our poor opinion of the Circle. He'd even offered a sizable donation to help the Inquisition build a mage tower of its own. "Did your Vint advisor suggest attacking my clan, or is that just how poorly you play the game?" "Your clan," the Duke sputtered, blood dotting up on his chin. "Whatever you want, whatever you people want, take it. Farmland. To the south, all of it can be CE. Don't tell me you thought I came here to negotiate. I have loyal friends in the Inquisition. I can get. I am the fucking Inquisition." At that I slammed my forearm against his throat, and Amalia loosened the guard's hold enough that he went reeling back into the wall where I pinned him. He peered at me wide-eyed, so much as all the blackened swelling would allow, but the recognition was slow to dawn on his features. We'd met, all right, but he'd never registered anything more than my Valislin. In Inquisitor Lavalan. But you're. Didn't matter what he was going to say, that was as far as he fucking got. As I brought my staff to bear, I remembered the good man Tom Rainier dug out from the shit of his soul, but by the time I'd cracked it down to call lightning, I was more concerned with the nightmare Sthias Amladaris found in his. In the next heartbeat, the room stank of charred flesh and I stepped back in disgust. He knew Inquisitor Lavalan, and he might have even liked her, but he'd never even realized my clan had a name. I'd been a person dressed in free marcher finery and sitting at a Shemlin table, but the rest of my people were simply rabbits in the woods, no different from any other mob of Dalish savages. None of it had anything to do with me at all. It was only that with or without my Valislin nobody ever really thought I was Dalish. I was the exception. Simply because I'd learned to navigate their world, everyone deigned to think I'd never truly belonged to my own. Chapter 77, A Flair for the Dramatic. I remembered finding Adeline outside the Duke's estate with one bare foot on a charred human corpse, bracing it to free her arrow. She had only a slightly glazed look about her, by far more composure than I'd managed after my first kill. Then again, considering the circumstances. "I want you to pierce my ears," she'd announced without preamble. "Oh?" I asked, not deviating from the script. 7 times, she insisted, and I didn't have to count the arrows missing from her quiver to know. How many'd you get? All of them, I said, Ma Melava Halani, but every one of them died because I said so. Don't make it personal, Adolin. Pray is pray, she shrugged, but even then I'd known she wouldn't feel so cocksure when the adrenaline wore off. Then why don't you have 100 earrings by now? She'd looked down, wiping one bloody foot in the grass. Yeah. Pierce me instead. I'll remember them for you. Details swam in the fade. She seemed younger than 15, and her Valislin flickered in and out as my mind's eye struggled to remember exactly where they went. A little heart-shaped curl on her chin, a twist of red outlining her amber eyes. But then she'd be baby-faced once more, the same girl who'd come to me crying, maybe it's not really magic. I hadn't dreamed a memory in a very long time, and the realization set the fade spinning forward to nightfall when she'd crawled into the bed that I'd made in the alienage, complaining that she couldn't breathe without the stars. We'd spooned up beneath the window where I'd shoved my cot, her head beneath my chin and my ear still throbbing from where she'd given up her guilt. They gave me a little house like this, I'd told her, but I didn't say how much I missed it. That stupid fucking Shemlin village, and the bright winter mornings when I'd walk outside to find Varric stamping his feet by the fire and Salas staring up at the breach. If I were honest, it wasn't Haven that I missed. I stood, leaving the memory of Adolin to venture into the alienage where Deshana and I met with their Haran beneath the Vihanadal, hammering out the first inkling of a treaty between our peoples. The people. Only this time it was Amalia standing there, wearing a simple muslin gown, her copper curls falling down around her shoulders. I could only catch bits and pieces of the soft lullaby she seemed to breathe, skipping notes of some melancholy tune. She cocked her head to the side, regarding me with something like relief before taking a step closer to brush back a stray lock of hair. She frowned. He will be furious with us. It was a clean step from the fade, but not pleasant. I shot forward all at once. Fuck, gods, my head. Thundering pain drove me back down into a filthy pallet, and my vision went white around the edges. When it finally cleared, I stared off in a daze, some long-forgotten part of me trying to make sense of the world by parsing out tracks in the dirt floor. One booted human, a barefoot elf, a cat. And here I was beginning to think I'd lost my touch. I twisted to look up at a bedraggled Shemlin with long black hair hanging in greasy locks, the shadow of a beard on his hollow cheeks. While I couldn't quite place his soft accent, I could almost taste the fate on him, a sense so powerful that I instinctively groped for a barrier. Good. That's good, sweetheart. You are safe here, but I am gladdened to see your strength return. Who the fuck are you? I'd cotton-mouthed something fierce, and the words stuck to the roof of my mouth. He dropped to sit on the edge of the mattress and pressed a palm to my forehead, pushing me back into the pillow with a flood of soothing magic. A healer, which means we're both apostates, so go ahead and iron out your knickers. I Arabellas. What happened? Dunno, love. Wasn't there. I mean, I tried sitting up again when I felt the pain subside, you healed me, so, what was wrong? You were dead. Oh, I breathed. You waltzed in here, smoke pouring out both eyes and looking straight through me. Fix her, you said. I'm a necromancer, I could scarcely get the words out fast enough. Nottin'. Trust me, he said with a wry smile, I know an abomination when I see one. I squeezed my eyes shut, thanking Amalia who took care of me better than any god. She buzzed at the edge of my awareness, alert but not alarmed, per se. When I opened them again, I realized the only light in the room came from a torch affixed to the wall. Deep shadows in every corner suggested a larger space, and only when my eyes adjusted did I see that it hardly deserved to be called a room. More of a closet, really, with mere inches to spare from the bed to a table cluttered with parchment and quills. The air felt cool and clammy on my skin, stagnant. A few links of sausage hung from a hook on the ceiling, as well as a braid of garlic in a knotted tangle of turnips, greens, and all. Along with a few bins of potatoes and apples, I could make out a cord of firewood stacked neatly along the wall. A root cellar, then. But there were books and piles of clothes all around, a wash basin and a straight razor and a little dish of cream on the floor. It had a rather lived-in feel, which could only mean that I was in his bed. The mage followed my gaze to the embroidered pillow dented beside me and shrugged a little sheepishly. I'm not that chivalrous. I shrugged it off in turn. How long have I been here? 3 days. Oh, gods. Shit. I have to G. Don't think so, love. The blighted Inquisition's tearing the city apart, we should lay low. My heart squeezed tight in my chest as I willed the anchor to remain dormant. Had it gone unnoticed for 3 days, or was he testing me? His brown eyes softened with a smile as he mistook whatever flashed across my features for pain. Here, let me get you something for that. I slumped back down into the bed while the mage stretched out to pluck a thin vial from the desk. Every inch the healer he claimed to be, he cradled the back of my head in his hand so that I could drink without sitting. I took the restorative in 3 halting sips, but gods, what I needed was Illyrium. I could hardly ask for that without sounding primed for a fight, so I determined to try and learn what had him so scared of me, in a roundabout way. What's the Inquisition even doing in the free marches? Bollocks if I know, he snapped. They swept in 2 days ago, ostensibly to keep peace after the riots, but it turned into a witch hunt straight away. I did remember the riots. It had taken little effort to win the human merchants to our side, severe taxes and regulations had poisoned their opinion of the Duke long before Red Lyrium, but the nobility framed the whole thing as an elven rebellion. I wasn't even sure how it started. We'd held Wycombe for 2 weeks, but one night a fire broke out in the High Quarter, then the looting began, and apparently I got myself fucking killed. Mythil's mercy. I couldn't even begin to imagine the clan's reaction to my disappearance, much less Cullen arriving on the scene and demanding answers from Des Hannah with Fenen snapping at his heels. What did you mean witch hunt? Exactly that. The former knight captain of Kirkwall himself is kicking down doors, shaking out the merchant's quarter. Sobering news for any mage who can remember his tenure in the gallows. I remember, I said, and it was true. Good. Then you know why you can't go out there. However often I reminded myself whatever we were before. I could not forget the decade Cullen spent as second in command to Meredith Stannard. Those years brought an endless string of apostates who fled the gallows, desperate to escape a regime that produced more blood mages, more corpses, more tranquil, than any 2 circles combined. Those years produced Samson. In a way, those years produced the Inquisitor herself, because the mages we sheltered and the Templars we fought marked the end of my childhood and the beginning of my time as first, when my mother died and Des Hannah took her place as keeper. If not for those bloody years, Des Hannah would not have become so invested in the outcome of the conclave. It took months before I'd finally understood Cullen's role in Kirkwall, but by then he was simply the kind-hearted Shemlin who'd blushed when I'd asked about his vows. I hear he's turned a new leaf, I said, aware of how glib it sounded. An opportunity he denied to how many mages? Have you ever met a tranquil? A few, I admitted, wondering despite myself if Cullen ever held the brand. Did you know any of them before? No. Then you cannot even begin to fathom what sort of monster the Inquisition has sent to Wycombe. I would rather run than hide. And blow my cover? No, thank you. Trust me, running always gets you caught. Androsta herself couldn't find a better hidey hole and we'd be fools to leave it. We must wait for this to pass. It's not going to pass, I countered, wondering how much I could safely say. I think he's looking for me. He suddenly paled. Does he have your phylactery? No, but... The mage laughed and scratched the back of his head. Listen, sweetheart, whatever you've done, I've a hunch that Lyrium-addled fool has a bigger prize in mind. He'll leave the marches empty-handed, I'll see to that. So I'm your prisoner. A genuinely wounded look crumpled his features. You're as weak as a newborn kitten, love. If I turned you out on the streets, you'd be dead by sunrise. I know you must be terribly frightened, but you're safe here, I swear it. I'm not as weak as you think, I said as calmly as I could. The only reason I'm still here is because I don't have the finesse to incapacitate you. Well then it's a good thing I don't have any wallop mallets lying about, otherwise you'd just bludgeon me and be gone. Such gratitude. I'm making a mess of this. I owe you my life and I'm more grateful than you can possibly know, but also more deadly. I don't have a defensive spell to my name, but I can take down an army. Holding back's what got me killed in the riots. Oh, right. I'll just turn you loose on the city, then. Lovely. I sighed in frustration and ran my fingers through my hair, finding rather suddenly that I had nearly none, just 2 jagged welts winding across the back of my skull. Sorry about that, he apologized. Low on lyrium. By the time I pulled you through the worst of it, I had no choice but to close it all up the old-fashioned way. I felt about with both hands, finding the fringe around my forehead untouched but the rest cropped down to my scalp. Gods, I'd have been better off if he'd simply shaved it. No, it's, thank you for saving me. I can't heal for shit. So I noticed, he smirked. I glanced down to see that I'd been bandaged from hip to collarbone, the gauzy strips stained here and there with blood turned brown by time. Below that I wore a pair of short pants, likely his own smalls. I pushed back a wave of concern, reminding myself that he'd provided healing even after Amalia dragged me to his door like an abomination. He wasn't the enemy, but that did little to calm my growing frustration. I tried to slow my breathing, but I was already lightheaded with panic, trapped underground in a tiny closet with a Shemlin mage, half naked and unarmed, while everyone I ever knew or loved thought I was dead or worse, in enemy hands. I could only assume that Cullen kept that fear in strict confidence, because if Corypheus believed me dead he'd fall on Skyhold in an instant. I'm the herald of Androsta. Maker's breath, he laughed, and here I thought I had a flair for the dramatic. I hate to break it to you, but she's Dalish. I scrubbed a hand across my damnably bare face, buying time to tamp down an all too Dalish response. Abellas, Phelan, but Cullen will take this city apart brick by brick if he has to. And if he can't find me, the Inquisition has a mage who can. And for a moment I thought of burrowing down deep, hiding from the world with this strange human and waiting for Solas to step through the fade to find me. He would, too. At the earliest sign of Cullen's failure to do so. I was first and foremost a weapon against Corypheus, and he'd see to it that I performed my fucking duty if it meant dragging me back to Skyhold himself. A desire demon couldn't have conjured a more tempting thought, and one likely would if I fell asleep anywhere but an Inquisition camp. I couldn't allow it. I took the Shemlin's hand, noticing how meticulously clean it was, nails clipped short and scrubbed pink, not even a trace of blood despite how much of mine he must have worn. I rubbed my thumb across his in what I hoped was a soothing gesture, then turned my left hand palm up. I swear to the creators no harm will come to you because of me. The anchor sputtered to life, the barest trickle of power that I could release, but by then I was pinned to the bed, his hand wrapped around my throat. Hairline cracks split across his features, spilling out traces of blue light before a blinding burst. His eyes were consumed by it, raw fade billowing out at the edges as he roared, "How did you find us? Creators, fuck." He was an abomination. He shrugged off my mind blast, and I clawed at his hand, trying to find my voice but discovering another instead. "Surrender to me," she whispered. But for an instant, real, nothing more. I fought them both, trying to breathe, trying to clear my mind, and then it was just fucking easier to let go. I seemed to fall back or float away, drifting to some place in the distance where I watched the scene unfold. "Release us," said the Navaran wearing my skin. "We have no interest in your affairs." "Kitty," he scowled. I felt an irrepressible urge to smile, though I didn't know why. "Justice. You know nothing of justice. Do I not?" The spirit in him relented by degrees for Amalia, and she raised one of my hands to his cheek. His scowl deepened, but he released his hold on me just as she did the same. Then the mage and I were well and truly alone, perhaps for the first time. I heaved up in the bed and onto my knees, coughing and choking and then shaking uncontrollably. Sweet fucking gods, she'd possessed me. "I apologize," he said flatly. "Are you all right?" I've never. It can be disconcerting." There was a warm hand on my back, but I was beyond caring. I tried to take calming breaths, tried to forget my tongue wrapped around someone else's words and my hand moving of its own volition. He came and went, some indeterminate period of time passing by, then the bed shifted as he sat down beside me. "Your things were beyond mending. But the girl who brings the water, I can have her fetch something for you to wear." "No. Just let me go." Please. All right. I never saw you. Good. He helped me to stand, and if he hadn't returned my staff I'd have fallen to my feet. He'd been right, I was in no condition to run. But with a barrier and a static charge, I felt confident that I could limp back to the alienage unmolested. If not, I was afraid enough that I wouldn't hesitate to simply leave a trail of corpses. When this is over, go to the Dalish and tell them Suvari sent you. I'll see you repaid. I don't need your gold. Yes, I said, glancing around the shithole, you do. He led me to a narrow stairwell against the wall, shoving open a wooden door mounted in the sloping ceiling to let snowflakes and starlight come pouring through. Perhaps a human girl would have shivered to set out barefoot into the night, but it was of no concern to me. Chapter 78, All But Invisible. When gravity slammed the door shut behind me, I found myself in the middle of a withered garden staring up at Andraste herself, one hand on her breast and the other outstretched to collect fat flakes of snow instead of alms for the poor. I couldn't help but stand in awe of his audacity. The apostate had dug in behind the fucking chantry. My first steps were tentative and short, fearful tests of strength. The lingering trauma of whatever happened to my head and chest left me too weak to vault over the wrought iron fence, while my nearly empty pool of mana kept me from stepping through the fade. So much for the mighty Inquisitor, penned up like a hala. I stumbled along the perimeter of the fence in search of an exit, but in truth I wasn't sure I could have walked the distance without its support. After an embarrassing length of time, I came upon a latch and pushed open a gate that swung on hinges greased to move in perfect silence. It released me into a narrow alley and I let the distant sounds of shouting turn me west. While the pain didn't bother me overmuch, I'd long since learned to shoulder an arrow and keep moving. It slowed my pace remarkably. I'd be useless in a fight other than to simply destroy everything in my path, so I kept my barrier tight around me and let Amalia curl in a little cloud at my feet. As one squalid street fed into another, it came as something of a shock to see how little attention I drew on my crawl. I passed my fair share of drunks and layabouts, but apparently the world found nothing unusual about a mostly naked elf, limping through the streets bloodied and bruised. Not even the thieves bothered me. When the back alley I'd chosen finally opened up into a down market square, I was relieved to spot Inquisition banners held high among the torches. Amalia eased back into the fade as I shouldered my way through a crowd of disgruntled merchants, half asleep and drawn from their beds by the furious banging that progressed from door to door. Grateful for the warm press of bodies all around, I paused to listen for snatches of conversation that might help me piece together how Cullen was playing this hand. Supposed to be poison, but it's just a rock. Probably worth a fortune, like rubies. Think I'd remember a glowing crystal, but no. Barged right on in. Checking every cellar, said, don't drink the water, but how am I gonna? It was a fantastic pretext, but then again I could only suppose that Cullen had experience enough conducting midnight raids. Never thought I'd want to be found by a Templar, much less at a total loss as to how I could make it happen. The wind that knifed through my barrier stole the air from my lungs, and I was quite certain I wouldn't be able to shout. Of course, I'd have no trouble getting attention with the anchor, but that wasn't exactly how I wanted to announce myself. The last thing we needed was for Corypheus to catch wind that I was gravely injured in 1,000 miles from Skyhold. Though it came as no surprise that our troops had been instructed to make a tight wall of their shields, it was maddening to find myself on the wrong side. Even if I had the stealth to slip through, I had no confidence that anyone would recognize me. Without my armor or the wild Dalish hair Meriden sang of, nothing but the anchor would identify me. I choked back something that could have been a laugh or a sob at the irony of being all but invisible amid the crowd of Shemlin frantic to find me. I fell back a pace, half wondering if I shouldn't try to find Joven instead. Not that I had any idea where to start, there was little chance he'd be sitting on his ass in the alienage, even less that I could make it that far. I'd severely overestimated my strength when I convinced the mage to release me. It was only thanks to elven ears that I heard the grumble of those jostled by a soldier shoving his way through the crowd, and a stroke of luck that I recognized him at all. It took everything I had, and the tiniest use of force magic, to outpace him before he reached the knot of Inquisition troops ahead. When I finally threw myself across his path, I didn't need to fake the yelp of my landing or the instinctive need to curl up as he barely avoided trampling me underfoot. With a shout for everyone to back the fuck up, the soldier knelt down to slip an arm under my shoulder, helping me to sit. That was quite the tumble. Need to get you to a healer, yeah. I slumped enough that he tightened his grip, then hid my face in the crook of his neck to whisper, "Krem." He didn't even pull back to check, just bundled me up into his arms while I clumsily wrapped my own around his neck. "Nice of you to finally turn up," he said in an even tone, rising to his feet with a grunt. "Sorry, got into a bit of a pinch. How we doing this? I've been out for 3 days, I'm open to suggestions." He molded over, then changed course to shoulder his way through the crowd. I tucked in my legs and clutched my staff behind him, trying to be small and inconspicuous in his arms. "Is the Iron Bull here? And leave that fancy castle of yours undefended?" "Not a chance. I came along in case the commander needed to move outside the Inquisition's jurisdiction, but looks like it won't come to that." "And the rioting? Over before we arrived. Apparently the Lady Volant talked pretty circles around those stuff-shirt nobles, now the whole lot of 'em are playing nice." He paused a moment, shifting me in his arms. "Oi, make way." With that, we broke through the line of soldiers and into the torchlight. "Commander," he shouted, "found this one in an alley, going on about red lyrium. Think we might finally get some answers." From where I rested my cheek against his leather collar, I couldn't see Cullen at all, but there was a shuffle of bodies and a shifting of shadows, then warmth behind me. "Anything specific to report, or just?" I twisted against Krem's breastplate to look over my shoulder, grimacing with the effort. "Fairly specific. Blessed Androsta," he swore, and I found something perversely satisfying in his horrified expression. It was the first time I'd seen Cullen since we parted ways in the Arbor Wilds, and while someone had surely warned him about my missing Valislin, I'd revived enough corpses to know I must look awful. I gave him a weak smile, "Looking for me?" His shoulder bunched with some ghost of a movement, and he let out a ragged breath. "Thank the Maker," he said, low as a whisper. He swiftly straightened to add sternly, "I don't have time for this A-classy. Find an Inquisition healer and send word to the elves. Ser." And with that we were moving through the crush of bodies once more, leaving Cullen to find the least suspicious end to his ruse. Krem took us down a broad street, and I watched over his shoulder as the crowded square became nothing more than a glowing point behind us. "I can walk, Krem." "Don't doubt it, your worship, but then we'd need all week to get there." I let a heavy sigh express my amusement and gratitude, then forced myself to relax. To a human I would have been a very small burden indeed. Without having to fight for every step, I became more aware of the pain radiating out from my chest and the cold that seemed to steep into my bones as the walk stretched on for an eternity. I ground my teeth together to keep them from chattering, but there was nothing I could do to stop my trembling. Long before I caught the stench of fish, I heard the rhythmic stretch of rope as ships strained against their mooring. We'd come to the port of Wycombe. Krem walked along the shabby promenade, boots clicking sharply against the wooden slats, until he came to a tavern with a pair of Inquisition banners and soldiers posted on either side of the door. "Welcome back, lad," said the one. "Evening, Lisa." Krem carefully backed through a door carved to read the dead helm, bringing us into a darkened foyer that sheltered the main hall from harsh winds whipping off the Amaranthin. I had a feeling Cullen objected on principle, but a tavern made sense enough as a base of operation, plenty of beds and stables and privies and a kitchen big enough to feed the lot of us. Krem set me gently on my feet, and I clutched at his shoulder for support while he opened the inner door. Inside, an enormous fire in the hearth bathed the room in warmth and light. Sweet Silas, the warmth was incredible. A few soldiers and scouts glanced our way, but most were caught up around what looked like an improvised war table. A strained voice was saying we won't know until we've cleared the rubble, and faces all around looked grim. However much I wanted to slink off and collapse in some private room, the tension had to break. Not with second-hand news that the Herald yet lived or the sight of a broken and bloodied girl, but with the triumphant Inquisitor who'd once brought down a mountain to save them. So I stepped away from Krem and disguised the weight I put on my staff as the same lazy confidence Varric brought to every gesture. The anchor blazed, and I grinned through the pain in my lungs to shout, "Maker's breath, what's an elf gotta do to get a drink around here?" There was a single heartbeat of perfect silence before the room exploded with shouting and thunderous applause that left me reeling. I rolled my wince into a wider grin and prayed that Cram would, in fact, bring the healer Cullen promised. Preferably, I thought, as a foamy mug of ale was sloshed into my anchored palm, sometime before I passed out. Chapter 79, Teeth. Cram had poured an elfroot potion into my ale before heading up to find a healer, but it might as well have been water. Red began to seep through my bandaging and I felt a heaviness in my lungs that wouldn't clear with a cough. Given how quickly the world began to swim around me, I was reasonably certain that I hadn't eaten in 3 days. Probably hadn't had more to drink than whatever the mage squeezed out of a wet rag either. Gods, I was thirsty. As soon I'd emptied my mug, another soldier came to exchange it, and I pushed my way through the tavern, slapping backs and apologizing that some fling with a cunnery had caused such a fuss. Of course no one bought it, but they didn't have to. They roared with laughter and catcalls for an inquisitor so completely unfazed by death that it was a joke. Mostly unfazed. Except for the spinning. Sweet gods. June. Sister. Sanuman appeared at my side, relieving me of my staff and wedging one shoulder under my arm. We teetered a few paces, then Joven slipped in on the other side to replace her, smiling with calculated mirth. "Around for the Dalish," he shouted, twirling me in his arms. Another cheer rose up, then there was a clashing of cups, a chug of ale, and a dance that carried us inconspicuously through the crowd. The voices roared in my ears, somewhere far away like a seashell, and I nearly blacked out, or maybe I did, because I was being carried up a stairwell and he was pinching the back of my leg. "Where've you been, mage?" "Hi, knifey." No. Keep those eyes open." I looked up at him so he'd know that I was trying, but I couldn't seem to hang on to any detail aside from the curling spaces in his valislin where his skin showed through. In the gaps I could still see the bare-faced apprentice, so dangerously quick that none of our hunters could handle him. Sanuman climbed the stairs a few paces above, her auburn hair unbound and wild from the winter wind. Then everything went choppy, a flash of moments I could barely register, cool blue light at the landing, the rattle of bones on my staff, Sanuman going flat against the wall, an undisguised menace when she said, "Back it up, flat ear." By then Joven had already skipped back, steady even as he dropped down 3 steps, shifting me in his arms only just enough to pluck a dagger from its sheath. "Hey, easy, San," said Krem. "He's a healer." Irabellas, Delenn. The resemblance is uncanny. My heart stopped. I'd clawed my way from the well of sorrows for that voice. Between the pain and ale, I couldn't quite remember what had ever been the problem or why I shouldn't fight my way back to him once more. I writhed against Joven, tugging on the veil to slip from his grasp. I landed on my feet just past Sanuman, and he spun at the sound as stunned as I remembered him in Redcliffe when he gasped, "You're alive." If there'd ever been a reason for us to be apart, he couldn't seem to remember it either. We met in a rush, my hand on the back of his neck to pull him down and his arms around me. I exhaled into him, wishing I was Amalia and that I could make him breathe me in. Melavagaras, I was babbling on the dregs of my own adrenaline. "Tell Rivas, Vihanan. I can't do this anymore, it's madness. I told you in the stairwell, Arlathma, F. She's delirious." He cut me off, and the world swung on its hinges as he swept me into his arms. Obviously. That was San, tense and wary as Salas took off down the hall in long, easy strides. From the scuffle of bare feet on hardwood, I knew that she and Joven followed close behind, though it seemed absurd they could make so much noise. Praise Ghilannain for leading her home. Something about Joven's tone bothered me, but it took everything I had to stay on the waking side of the veil. Instead, I focused on the man who held me, how lines of tension jumped from his neck to his jaw, and the frown that played at the corner of his mouth. I pushed at him with a curl of mana and, for a heartbeat, his eyes blinked shut. When they opened, his face was serene, the mask in place. A burst of force magic threw open a door at the end of the hall, and then I was sinking into a narrow human bed that smelled like home. Salas turned from me to stand shy of his full height, shoulders rolled forward like a much older man. He wrung his hands together as he had the day we met, neither a powerful mage nor an ancient noble, but a soft-spoken hermit. "I apologize for such a poor introduction," he said, almost bashful as he cleared his throat. "I fear I let myself be swept up in the Inquisitor's delirium." I am Salas, a healer. Joven leaned against the doorframe, lanky and careless as he glanced down the hall to hide the dark side of his valislan, something he did only to put outsiders at ease. Oh, gods, he was hunting. No apologies needed, Phelan. Suvariolas has always been a force of nature. Andoran audition. I am Joven, and this is Sanuman. We tend the clan's Hala. Forgive me, Haran. I should not have spoken so rashly, fear for my sister has me on edge. The fault is mine, Delenn, but I must ask that you now entrust the Inquisitor to my care. There is much to be done. Of course, said Joven. Lethalin, go home, rest. Ask Fenen to watch the herd tonight, and do be discreet. He will not share our tolerance for your sister's indiscretion. I swallowed, reaching for words but finding none. In the newfound warmth of the bed, I was consumed by sloth. I could only listen, lazy and limp as sounds sloshed into my ears. I heard the clatter of enchantments and crystal, my staff being set against the wall, then footsteps retreating down the corridor. A weight dipped the bed at my side, and two long fingers settled against the underside of my wrist. Shut the door, said Salas, counting the beats of my heart. There was a soft click of metal and wood, then Joven broke the ensuing silence with Dalish swearing about the damnable cold. He rattled about the hearth, repositioning the logs, fumbling with the tinderbox, blowing puffs of air to fan the flames. I feel I should apologize, Haran. Suvar is free to love whom she wills, but her position within the clan is precarious. There are those who would use her affair with an outsider as further proof of disloyalty. Salas exhaled sharply through his nose. How quickly the Dalish turn their allies into traitors. Let me assure you that the Inquisitor and I are not involved. That's a relief, Haran, Joven said before dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, because we've been fucking like teenagers these past few weeks. For a moment back there though. Your concerns are both crass and unnecessary. Abellas, I just. Vihanan's a heavy word. Ma SA never said anything about anyone else, and I was so glad to have her back I didn't ask any questions and, well, it's a relief is all. The Inquisitor has lost an extraordinary amount of blood. She is apart from herself. Yeah, she's in bad shape, but she's pulled through worse. I mean, she survived that explosion. Her injuries following the conclave were magical in nature, requiring my expertise, but this is purely physical, blunt trauma that even a human surgeon could manage. He continued to trickle healing magic through my veins, oblivious that he'd played right into Joven's hand, revealing himself as the mage who saved me Elvain. But Ma SA said nothing, biding his time. I lolled my head to the side and when my vision cleared I found Joven cross-legged by the fire, braiding his hair as if he hadn't a care in the world but his own vanity. Salas ran his fingertips along the scars on my scalp with a sigh. Inquisitor, who healed you? With some effort, I turned to face him, managing the words, death magic. I was unaware you could raise the dead to treat your injuries. These are fine stitches. Saw it in the fade. A fit of giggles consumed me, tearing at something in my chest, but gods it seemed terribly funny. How he kept his secrets and expected none from me. The laughter gave way to coughing, the taste of blood, and Salas lifting me to sit before I could choke. Then a rough cloth was wiped across my mouth and the rim of a mug pressed to my lips. Blood lotus, sleep. Salas eased me back down into the bed, pausing to untangle the fingers I'd wound up in the cords of his amulet. His expression turned sharp. And what sort of healer strangles his patient? Through half-lidded eyes I saw the breath of his question hanging like a cloud, but I was too far gone to answer. He cocked his head to the side and reached toward me, slowly shifting to match the pattern of what he saw until he arrived at a perfect approximation of justice with one hand coiled around my throat. Shem, by the size of it, said Joven, coming to stand behind him. No more than an hour old, bruise hasn't even purpled. Salas glanced over his shoulder, perhaps catching his first hint of suspicious, but Joven only shrugged. You ever been kicked by a Hala? No one feels sorry for you till the color turns. Doesn't matter, the blighter's dead now. I wish that were so, but I suspect she spared him. How soft do you think she is? She's been killing Shem since she was 12. If the Inquisitor thought she owed a man her life, she would not take it. I don't know how Suvari plays this Herald of Andraste thing, but she's no Chantry sister. On that point we can agree. Joven was grinding down his patience, but it all seemed impossibly far away, like something overheard in a tavern. Then there was a warm pressure against the skin at my hip, the shhhrrrrppp of cotton giving way to a blade, fresh air against my belly, and stillness, the remaining bandages uncut. Perhaps you should wait outside, Delenn. I'd prefer to watch. Whatever your relationship to the Inquisitor, I see no reason why treating her injuries should require an audience. Relax, she loves that sort of shit. I mean, he cleared his throat, an audience. Get out. Oh, the possessive type? Here I thought we could share. The Inquisitor is not a thing to be possessed or shared. You say that, but wait till you're balls deep and she's sucking another maw. Salas flew to his feet. There was a tumbling and a sudden thud, then Joven wheezing around his own laughter. I willed my eyes open and saw him pinned against the wall by nothing but gravity gone wrong. His smile consumed him, curling Elgernan's mask. There we go. She said you had teeth. I should thank you, child. I had spent time with few of your people before this. From the stories, I thought you all thuggish, simple and crude. Now I know I was right. Don't let that bare face fool you, Harin. She's Dalish to the core. Is she? I scraped against the veil, refusing to lose consciousness, but my body felt adrift. Panic burned away all the dreamy sentiment to leave only the man who'd left me bare in Crestwood, and the sure knowledge that he'd throw the truth about Valislin in Joven's face because there was nothing he loved more than being right. I strained to find my feet. Salas, please don't hurt him. Joven finished, suddenly behind me with a knife at my throat. All right, let's try this again. Salas spun, caught completely unawares by a trick better suited to Cole. Do you think I am concerned? She could slip from your grasp in a heartbeat. But she won't. Suvari, do you remember what it means to have a knife at your throat? Arlathma. That you're an ass. Good girl, he said, patronizing on the surface but relieved underneath. When he exhaled he smelled of Vandalaria. Chapter 80, Phalassin. Panic melted my pain and fatigue, a shock of ice water that left me breathless and alert. I didn't know what he was playing at, but Joven had surely caught a hint of my disloyalty in Salas' subtle challenge. Or had he only fixated on how I'd seemingly leapt to his defense? He'd got me wrong, though. I didn't fear Salas would hurt my SA, I feared he'd destroy him. Despair heightened my senses he still might. Told in malice, the truth of our Valislin was a slavery of its own. Just another way for the Elvaean to control our history, deny our agency, spit on our ancestors, the first generation of elves privileged to choose what their parents could not. If it were ever to be accepted, the truth couldn't come from the flat-ear who hated us. Joven held me close, one arm snaked around my hips and the other laid across my collarbone, his dagger a firm line of pressure that bit into my skin when I swallowed. For his part, Salas seemed perfectly at ease aside from a thread of irritation that drew his brows together. He took a calming breath, pursed his lips. Inquisitor, forgive my lack of concern, but your life is in no danger. Joven purred with amusement behind me. You don't understand what's happening here, do you? She's Herellen, old man. She spat on Mithil, gave the well of sorrows to Hashem, and came home a bare-faced liar. The only reason she's alive now is that our keeper invoked Vir Sullivanen. My stomach dropped, whatever Salas read in my expression, something shifted in his pale eyes. He didn't have say it, the command was written in every fiber of his being, go. Joven immediately shifted closer, who's got faster reflexes. My whole universe split against the burning edge of his knife, so sharp it felt like an inexplicable brightness rather than pain at all. Only the unmistakable blood-song of magic spilling from my veins told me that I'd been cut. If I so much as twitched my fingers to fold the veil, it wasn't pretend anymore. Joven bet his life on me the first night I'd come home, and I could only hope that he meant me to return the favor. But gods, he danced along the script of my nightmares on the waking sea. Too close, far too close. My SA, my voice caught between faith and doubt. Jovan could say Arlathma with a knife, but, oh, I'd have never lied in the first place if I didn't know how he'd say goodbye. Salas spoke before I could even catch my breath, his voice low and menacing. Maharil, Delenn. It wasn't even directed at me, but his severity raised the hairs on the back of my neck. However many times circumstance churned up the darkness within him, I'd never known Salas to call it up at will. The shadows all around seemed to deepen, and I could feel the veil gathering around him. If he stepped through the fade to fetch me, he'd leave an icy corpse in his wake. Even so, the rise and fall of Jovan's chest against my back remained steady and calm, while my own breaths came in too shallow, too fast. I was hyperventilating. Easy, easy, Jovan soothed, feathering a kiss against my shaved scalp. I've poisoned you, don't get your heart rate up. Which means, Harin, fuck with me, she's dead. What does your keeper want? Answers. Then you shall have them. The tip of Jovan's blade touched the underside of my chin, tilting my head back into his shoulder. Don't take your eyes off him, mage. Knifey remained unspoken between us, all too real in the brilliant point pressed beneath my jaw. If I opened my mouth to say anything, I'd have driven it home. Instead, I made a soft sound in the back of my throat and prayed it didn't sound like a whimper. When were you born? He didn't hesitate to answer what I'd never been brave enough to ask. 895, blessed. I'm not a chantry scholar, add it up for me. How old? 47. Your name day. Solace first, he said, a date that snapped into place so easily I didn't have to imagine how a mother might have chosen to honor the occasion. And do you wish to know the constellation of my birth? Nah. Just figuring out how many years you got on her, old man. Salas dropped his eyes to the rug. I might have imagined the corners of his mouth twitching down, but the color flushing high along the blade of his ear wasn't firelight. I'd never seen him embarrassed, a look so unrehearsed, so untempered by the game, that for a moment there was no mask at all. Just a man, not ancient but aged. Dark crescents hung beneath his eyes and shadows pooled in the hollow of each cheek. The pallor of his complexion spoke of a difficult journey. I could almost see him buried in the hold of some ship, barred from peace in the fade by the drunk and frantic dreams of sailors and soldiers all around. Hey! No sleeping, not yet, Teherellen, said Jovan, biting my ear until my eyes snapped wide. You were with her at the Well of Sorrows. Yes. Tell me what happened. We found the temple protected by a high priest of Mythil, an Elvaean who fell into Othenera after serving the goddess incarnate. Against his advice, the Inquisitor entered the Well of Sorrows. 1,000 voices called out from the deep, revealing the human mage in our midst to be the daughter of Ashbelinar, the chosen of Mythil. There was no risk I'd fall into sleep again. I was electrified by his casual conviction. Suvarai said no such thing. She is wise not to spark a pilgrimage that would bring countless innocents to Skyhold at a time when we brace for battle. The facts will stand up to your keeper's scrutiny. The witch Morrigan was a known companion to the hero of Ferelden, and her mother infamous throughout southern Thedas as Flemeth, though your people revere her by a different name. I was utterly stunned. I'd never considered the stories about Flemeth anything more than human adaptation of elven lore, a grasping attempt to claim Ashbelinar as their own. However many times I'd read Tale of the Champion, I'd always envisioned a mighty elven mage. I'd heard him tell the story myself, but had Varric actually described her as such? Jovan twisted, pressing his lips against my neck, giving his voice the barest whisper. Is it true? It is. It was, even if it never occurred to me before. What happened to her Valislin? Oh, gods, he was relentless. I wet my lips, wishing I could beg Salas not to take this last thing from me. He met my gaze, smiling as softly as he had that night by the waterfall. You are so beautiful, he'd said, but that had only been a kindness to soften the blow of what would follow. Tears spilled as soon as I blinked. In another heartbeat, it would be over. The Inquisitor waded into the Well of Sorrows, and by the following sundown her Valislin were gone. How? By faith, said Salas, as sincere as I'd ever heard him. She has known divinity since Haven, but only after the Temple of Mythil could she surrender herself to it. By that devotion she has been made pure, beloved, and precious to a god. She has witnessed the truth of ancient Arlathan, and in her own time its fullness will be revealed to the people. He spoke with such authority that for a moment I felt as if Crestwood had been a nightmare and this gorgeous lie the truth. I was stunned by the ease with which he framed the deepest betrayal I'd ever known as a blessing from mythal creators. Had he bluffed Abellas as well? My confidence began to crumble. Everything felt so undeniably real at the Well of Sorrows, but in a dingy Shemlin tavern, away from the raw magic of the arbor wilds and the fevered confusion I'd carried since Crestwood, Salas seemed no more or less the man Varric wouldn't trust in a game of wicked grace. You know that for a fact. Joven's grip on the knife went slack. It wasn't a question or a demand, but a sort of awestruck realization. She's been lying, but you're not. Why is that? He looked stricken, but only for an instant. Because I've had more time to grow accustomed to uncomfortable truths. Salas, stop. It was all I could manage before Joven twitched the blade enough to remind me that he was still hunting. What does that even mean? Salas wasn't looking at Joven anymore, but I wasn't sure he was looking at me either. Through me, perhaps. He'd gone half adrift in the fade, I could hear it in the cadence of his voice. Which meant he was playing the mystic, giving himself time to consider every word, twisting his scorn for Dalish belief to mock and protect me at the same time. She has become much more than a would-be shepherd to a lost and forgotten flock. She holds the key to our salvation, one that cannot be surrendered. Reclaiming the orb may cost everything, but the people can afford no less. This is the terrible burden of a god, a duty that cannot be lifted from her shoulders, no matter the cost. I'd had enough. I tried again to wrench myself from Joven. He held me fast, but eased up with the blade. Is that why you tricked me in Crestwood, to force my hand? Fuck you, Fenharel. I wouldn't have faltered. No, he said. But I very nearly did. I'd no idea if it were the truth or another performance. Apparently there was no lie he could not bend the world to reflect. But that exact sort of reckless desperation had given me strength to say cast your spell. Joven whistled under his breath. Must have been some trick, Harin. It was not a trick, Rial. No, it was a gift. My gift to you. Me giving up everything to be at your side, and you spitting in my face. Cole, he said softly, has made that painfully clear. I failed to realize it was a symbol you held dear or that it was given in sacred trust. What would you do without a spirit of compassion? You have none of your own. Emma Irabellas, I should never have taken it from you. Joven cleared his throat. Obviously we're not talking about her virginity. Salas tucked 2 fingers into the high collar of his undershirt and paused, his eyebrow raised in question. Joven brushed my ear nodding his consent, and Salas fished deeper, pulling out a fine obsidian chain. One sharp pull, then he held it at arm's length. The necklace swayed to and fro with a hypnotic rhythm, weighted in the middle by my sylvanwood ring. Check the description for the links to the author.